My name is Becca Bearson. I'm the assistant children's librarian at the Rogers Memorial Library in Hudson, New Hampshire. For everybody who will be watching this is the extremely talented Ismée Williams.
Oh, thanks.
Amazing book that I could not stop reading. I had to read it in one sitting. This train is being held. I guess I'll just jump right in with some of the questions that I wrote down.
Sure.
My first question is, I love the poems that Alex wrote for Issa in the story.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly, in addition to being a very talented novelist, you're also a poet.
Oh,
Have you ever considered publishing a poetry collection?
that's an excellent question. When I was younger, I did dabble a lot in poetry, but and my grandfather, my Cuban grandfather was a poet, and he was published, and his father was published as poets. But I never really thought my poems were very good. They tended to be very romantic and flowery. That was always like the feedback that I got. So I haven't really thought about it now. I really enjoyed sort of harnessing that like kernel of poetry that I have inside me to use in this novel. And I was a little nervous that people would read it and be like, "What is this? She's not a poet. Why is she writing this?" So I'm so glad that you liked it.
All right. I guess my next question goes, since there's so many topics in this book, baseball, dance, poetry, mental illness, racism, complexity of Latino families, and social class. Out of these many topics, were there any that you had to do some extensive research for?
Yes. So I don't know very much about baseball, I have to say. I was sort of like Issa. I've been to a bunch of Yankee games, and usually like my favorite part is when we stand up and we do like the YMCA at like the eighth inning stretch. I'm not usually, and it's easier for me to follow a baseball game if I know the players and they're like characters in my head. I'm like, oh, there's that player. But my husband loves baseball. He's a huge baseball fan. He knows all of the different statistics that people memorize for the different teams and whatnot. And so luckily I was living with a baseball expert, and he grew up playing baseball, but not in New York City. So I also used a lot of my friends. So I have a lot of other mom friends who have teenage boys who are playing baseball at high levels in the city. And actually somebody in my writers group has a son who's out of college now, but he almost went professional. He was playing at that level. So I made use of my extensive friend network for areas that dealt specifically with having a teenage boy playing baseball, and what's the next step, that things that my husband wasn't able to answer.
All right. My next question is kind of about the setting. So Issa and Alex, while they meet on a train, that's not the only place that they go. They explore the city a bit. He walks her to the dance class. They mention bakeries and schools throughout New York.
Mm-hmm.
Did you explore parts of New York that were new to you in order to write Issa and Alex's story, or did you already know all of those places?
That's an excellent question. So I knew all of the places except for where Alex lives in Sunset Park in Brooklyn. I did not know that area at all. So I had to do some research for that. But everywhere else in the city was a place that I had been, and I had been a lot. So I live on the Upper West Side. I'm always taking the 1 train. I worked up at Columbia on 168th Street for over 15 years. I trained and worked there as a doctor. So I was always taking that train and getting off on that subway stop at 168th Street all the time. So I knew what that area looked like. I spent a lot of time, walking around that area, going from the hospital to my clinic. So I felt very comfortable with that area. And I also felt very comfortable with the whole Lincoln Center area with the dance where Issa goes to do dance. I wouldn't say that that was necessarily my neighborhood, but I spent a lot of time there. And also the area where Issa lives is the area where my kids go to school right now.
Oh, cool.
So I've spent a lot of time in that area as well. But Brooklyn, I was not familiar with. So I did do research on Brooklyn.
That's really cool. So you can definitely get so much sensory aspects of the place and was was is it hard to conceptualize a place that you lived in and your characters are in and take your senses and put it into words without being too detailed, but still get conveying the message of this place that you're trying to talk about?
I would say in some ways it's easier for me. I tried my hand at writing a fantasy, so I'm gonna like answer the question using a different way. I tried my hand writing a fantasy manuscript, and that was much harder because I didn't even really understand what the world was. I was sort of writing as I was developing the idea of the world in my head, which is, if you talk to fantasy writers, they say that's a big no-no. You have to have built your world before you start writing.
Oh,
Whereas if, writing about a place that I know pretty much by heart was easier because I already knew what it looked like. And I had such a vivid picture in my head. And I knew I didn't need to give all of the details. I could just give a couple of the details so that it wasn't so much of an overload. Whereas that was definitely one of the constructive critiques I received from my writers group from the world building. There's so much detail. Like, you don't need to tell us like every single thing.
So I wanted to say that one thing I loved about this, while I don't speak Spanish, I always enjoy when there's other languages incorporated into the book's narrative. You did a really great job incorporating Spanish throughout Alex's narrative.
Thank you. Thank you.
Not a lot of books do that. Do you think that books that are about characters who speak another language don't do that because they're worried that maybe the reader will get frustrated or not? Because I think it's actually makes the book better, personally.
Yeah, I think, it was important to me because Alex's character, his Dominican heritage, and this idea of him sort of straddling two worlds and being able to code switch between whether he's talking with Issa versus whether he's talking with his friends versus when he's talking with his parents. That's a big part of his journey and his fabric. And sort of this feeling of am I comfortable in all of these spaces and how are people perceiving me? So I had to include that for him. I think it's necessary to do that if the character in the story calls for it. I tend to agree with you. I think it makes the story maybe a little bit richer, gives it more dimension. But I've also had feedback that some people didn't like it because they get frustrated because they don't understand the words. That being said, for instance, my editor doesn't speak Spanish. And so in some ways it was great because if she didn't understand what was going on, then that meant I wasn't giving enough contextual clues. It's nice to put it there, especially if you are somebody who speaks Spanish, because then you can hear it and you can feel it. Like, it feels very realistic. And it's true. It's very true. I see it all the time with my patients, with my I have friends who are Spanish speaking, and we switch back and forth. Like, in one conversation, we're going back and forth between speaking English and Spanish. That's just something that a lot of people who are bilingual do. So again, I like it. I don't think it's necessary in every single case. And I think if it's done, you do have to make sure that there's enough information there for readers. You shouldn't have to require readers to know another language while they're reading your book. I guess, put it that way.
So this book has so many interesting topics that are very relevant right now. I was on a webinar where some other authors, and one author was talking about the idea of using sensitivity readers topics. I know that there's quite a divide on that. Did you do it? Did you think about doing it? If not, or
yeah, no, excellent question. I did use it. So, and also the word sensitivity reader, sometimes it's called an inclusion reader. Like, I've heard the language changing a little bit. So I had actually 3 sensitivity readers. So I felt very comfortable understanding sort of what Issa's journey was, because I have a lot of similarities with her. I was a dancer. I am somebody who is white, but who is also Cuban. And so depending on what context people meet me, they can assume one or the other or neither, or, they make assumptions on me about me based on what I look like. But for Alex, that's very different. Alex is brown skinned, and he also is very athletic and big. And so one of his sort of internal wounds is that doesn't he doesn't like that a lot of people judge him based on what he looks like. And they have these preconceived notions of what he will be like based on what he looks like. And I can definitely relate with that. I drew on the fact that I'm this petite woman who very often was overlooked or discounted, for things like going to medical school, and people often mistake me when I was in the hospital, for a nurse instead of a doctor. That's so I could draw off of that. It's not the same. It's definitely not the same. What Alex has gone through and what people like Alex go through is much more everyday and potentially harmful than what I experienced. But I could draw off a little bit on myself. But I wanted to make sure that somebody who potentially went through Alex's, lived more of his life, like growing up in the city. Because that's the other thing. I live in the city, and I've lived in the city for 20 years, but I didn't live in the city as a kid. So I found a 20-something-year-old young man in college who was very similar to Alex, whose parents are Dominican. He grew up in the exact area where Alex grew up, and he played baseball. And I found him through friends of a friend. And I had him read the book sort of for accuracy, for just sort of the experience. So that was one. We had a second person who was a sensitivity reader who was actually very familiar with young adult literature specifically. So and that person picked up a lot of other things that the first sensitivity reader said, no, this is all great. This is all accurate. Some of his suggestions were like the way that I would spell the slang. Like he's like, oh, I would spell the slang a little differently. Oh, fine. But it's slang. So it's like always, it could be spelled differently, but I would change based on that. But he didn't have any other big picture, like, oh, people might think this is offensive. Whereas the other person was picking up on other things like, oh, you have to be careful about how you portray this because some people might take offense. Tread carefully here. And so those two readers were more specifically for Alex's point of view, but they served different purposes. One was like for accuracy, and the other one was definitely much more being aware of all the potential things. Because, honestly, a lot of time, you try your best, but sometimes if you're not in it and it's not you don't see it. It's like your blind spot. So I needed somebody to tell me what my blind spots were, because of course I'm biased because I'm white. I grew up white. Like I grew up kind of privileged. So I needed help with that. And then the third sensitivity reader was actually a psychologist, somebody I did not know. So I do have personal experience with bipolar disorder, not me, but I've grown up around it. And I also have friends, because I'm a doctor, I have friends who are psychiatrists and psychologists who I was able to use as I was writing the story. But beyond that, my editor wanted to have an external person who didn't know me, which I think is very true. It's important to find readers who don't know you and they're not like your friends, because sometimes they don't want to hurt your feelings by pointing out a flaw. So that was great. And we made a couple of tweaks based on the other psychologists' suggestions to make sure that we were treating the very serious topic of mental illness appropriately.
Nice. So some of the things that you just touched upon, I did read your amazingly well-written We Need Diverse Books article. That was really
Oh, great. Thank you.
Some of those things I feel like we're kind of go into the own voices and we need diverse books movements. And I'm going to kind of switch gears into the more publishing aspect of it. If that's okay.
Sure.
So the publishing industry has historically not been a very diverse place, but that seems to be changing. Do you think that this could be linked to the Own Voices movement, as well as the success of the We Need Diverse Books organization and the amazing outpouring of more diverse books, and not just YA, but all across the genres?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely is. I mean, so Water in May, which was my first novel, was purchased in 2015, and that was before this whole movement. So I sort of rode on the wave coming up. And I did not write that book because I wanted to write about a diverse character. I just happened to write a story about a diverse character because that was a story I wanted to tell. And it wasn't own voices because it was based on my experience taking care of pregnant teens in New York City, and interacting with them. I think the publishing, right. So historically, the issue has been that most of the people in power in publishing are white. And interestingly, most of the people who work in publishing are women, but the people in power tend to still be white males. And that, again, we talked about blind spots, and, it's like, well, you know what you like, and, this is what you want, but what you want and what you like might not be different, or is definitely not going to be the same as another person potentially. And so it's important to have a diversity in the gatekeepers of the whole publishing world, in terms of agents, editors, and higher up administrators in publishing who are calling the shots of what books are going to be bought, and how much marketing we're going to put behind which other book. So there are definitely changes happening there, where publishing houses and agencies are trying to make sure that they have different voices represented within their houses. And I'm not just even talking about race and ethnicity. There's also sexuality, gender identity, ability level, right? So that's like ableness is a whole nother area where we haven't seen a lot of diversity. And then we see it in the authors and in the stories that are being told. There's still work to be done, because if you look at the numbers, still the majority is white. And if you look at the numbers of authors, it's usually white women. And we want more voices. We want more voices to come to the stage. And I think that is still, that is happening. But there are still books that are written about diverse characters. And this is where it gets tricky, because I think a lot of authors, recognize that they want to write, even if they live in a place where there isn't a lot of diversity, they want to write a story that includes a lot of diversity. But obviously, all of that diversity isn't going to necessarily represent them, because you're just one person. So you can't be one person and have a claim to all these different cultures and all these different races and all these different ability levels and sexuality. And it'd be very hard to be that person. And so how do you balance that? How do you have characters that are so representative of the world when you are just one person? Which is, why I think it is important you do your research and you get sensitivity readers, because unlike adult literature, because I'm writing for youth, right, for children and young adults, I think the bar is higher. Like, you want to make sure that you're not going to do any harm, that you're not going to write something and publish something that's going to hurt somebody who is from that background that you're representing, that they're going to receive that and it's going to make them feel badly in any way.
I agree. This next question is kind of more craft related. Mm-hmm. I'm a huge sucker for books that have alternating narrators. But one thing that I absolutely loved about This Train Is Being Held was that instead of numbering the chapters, you kind of had a timeline. And I feel like that really helped me. I would have already loved in these characters anyway, but I felt like I was just like, my time with them was just like counting down as the pages got less. And I loved the use of the dates on the chapters. As you were writing the story, did you need to keep a calendar out with the timeline to help with plots and kind of things like that?
I did. And, the timeline of the story changed, because in my first draft, it was actually much longer. It was over 3 years. And then we decided that was too long, that most books, especially for young adults, that's just like too long a time to drag it. So then we didn't shorten sort of the arcs of what was happening, but I condensed it to happen over a shorter period of time. And then I forgot what year I picked, but I printed out the month, I think maybe it was 2017. I don't know. I picked a year and then I printed out all the months for that year and then the next year, so I could see like on what days things were happening, so that I could also see in my mind how much, because I also wanted to make it not completely unrealistic, because there is an element of fantasy in there that they're running into each other on the subway. I mean, I definitely run into friends on the subway on occasion, but not usually all the time. So I had to be like, okay, well, it's unlikely they're going to run into each other like 2 days in a row. Like, so unless they're planning it, like, so how much time would have had to elapse before they might see each other again, and what would be the circumstances? So I did use that, and I did use the calendar, and I had the sheets with the calendar, and I would move my Post-it notes on the dates to show, because I also moved things around and like, oh, well, if it's a Saturday or if it's a holiday, is the subway going to be more crowded or less crowded? Like, what's going on? How do I want this scene? And what time? And based on their schedules too, what time of year is it? Does he have baseball practice? Does he have a baseball game, or is he working at the baseball center? Versus Issa was a little easier because you can dance ballet all year round. Like, you're basically doing the same thing all the time, except when it's the Nutcracker. But the baseball, I had to keep track of that as well, the seasonality to it.
Nice. And then another thing, this also kind of has to do with the plot. I feel like Issa's also very sensitive. Sometimes how she doesn't realize in the scenes where Alex is hurt by Issa's actions, I don't think it's because Issa was she never intentionally wanted to hurt him, but I think she just, in the way that she communicates or doesn't communicate, she doesn't realize that things that are important to Alex, such as like telling her parents that he's from the Dominican Republic, right? Yep.
Mm-hmm.
She says it doesn't matter, but to her that means it doesn't matter because she likes him. But when he hears that, it means it doesn't matter, just and your identity is not important. Was it hard to just write two different people who communicate their emotions in two different ways? Because they do have very different levels of communication.
I would say what was hard was keeping their voices very distinct. Actually, Alex's voice was very easy. For some reason, I just got his voice right away. Like, he just came fully formed. Issa, I had to work on a little bit more. And I just had to keep going back to, okay, what are their goals? What is their emotional journey? What are they feeling right now? I purposely wrote that scene because, again, it just gets back to that same, your blind spot. I mean, because she's white and privileged, and so for her, being Cuban was never an issue. Like, she was never prejudiced against that. I think she has probably been prejudiced against because she's a woman and she's blonde and she's pretty, and people probably think that she's not as smart as she is. And so in her mind, she doesn't think Alex being Dominican and having brown skin is an issue, because it's not an issue for her, and she's never been in his shoes. So she doesn't realize how actually it is for a lot of people. And that's part of the being so different, like having very different experiences, and her not actually being able to understand that until he tells her later. I think that would be a pretty common thing between like somebody who's privileged and somebody who isn't. The privileged person being completely clueless about what the other person might be thinking or feeling.
Another aspect of communication in this book that's coming from a completely different angle was social media. And as someone who uses social media a lot, it read totally realistically. Are you somebody who naturally just likes social media and all the nuances and etiquette, if you will, came naturally to, or did you need to research a little bit how that goes?
So I have to say I learned all about social media in 2015 when I sold my first book. Mm-hmm. So it was interesting because as a physician, we were told, way back when it was just like Facebook, you can't go on Facebook, you can't post pictures of yourself with alcohol, you can't, because your patients might find you. You have to basically be invisible to social media. So that's what I had been told. It's different now for doctors, because now they're realizing that they can also use social media to educate and contact with patients. So it is different. But when I was training, it was a strict no social media policy. But then I sold my first book, and my publicist said, okay, great. What's your Instagram handle? What's your Twitter handle? And I was like, what? So I had to learn about all of that, which I was happy to do because I have kids. My oldest now is 15, but at the time she was 10. So she wasn't on social media yet anyways, but I was thinking, well, it's probably good as a parent to understand the platforms and so that I can supervise. So that was a huge learning curve. But so I do use Instagram. I do use Twitter. I use Facebook mostly for marketing purposes for my books and trying to connect and engage with other authors and readers. But I didn't grow up using it as a teenager. I do have teenagers in my house, so I can see how they're using it. I didn't, and it's funny because I was like, would they be using Instagram or Snapchat or, you know, and then I remember at one point I read Ibiza Bowie's Pride, and she calls it the gram. She doesn't call it Instagram. And my first draft was already in. And I was like, oh my gosh, our team's calling it the gram now. And so then I asked a whole bunch of like teen, like from like my nephews and like people in different parts of the country. And basically even within New York City, they call it different things based on where you are.
Oh, I
Like,
never knew that.
like so people in Manhattan, they say, like they were telling me, oh, if somebody calls it the gram, they're trying to be like cool and they're so not cool. And, you know, whereas in the other book, it was, everybody was calling it the gram. So I was like, I'm just going to call it Instagram. Like, I like gave up trying to be like the cool, trying to figure out, because it's true. All of that stuff changes. And, you know, next year it's going to be different anyway. So, I mean, that is one of the tricky things, because sometimes, you know, the book ends up being dated by the technology in it. So in 10 years, if somebody's reading this, they might be like, wait, that's how they used Instagram? That's so weird. You know, like we do it this way now. But it was fun to do. And honestly, I know a lot of teens who spend much more time on social media than Alex and Issa do. But part of what I wanted, the characters that I wanted to create were characters who were so highly focused and so driven by their extracurriculars that they just didn't have a lot of time for anything other than their extracurriculars and their families and their school. And so social media wasn't a priority for them.
Yeah. Nice. I have two more questions.
Cool.
In your bio, it said that when you were on bed rest with your third baby, you picked up a YA novel and fell in love with it. And I'm dying to know what book it was.
It's so embarrassing though to like keep sharing this. I shared it on a webinar, like also during this lockdown. I feel like this lockdown is making me just like a little bit more like whatever to share. But I have to admit, so backstory. So I had not read a fiction novel in about 11 years. I had basically gone to college where I was reading fiction, and then I started medical school. Then I did, which was 4 years. Then I did 3 years of residency. Then I did 4 years of fellowship.
Oh, wow.
And then I wasn't attending. And at the end of my fellowship, I did 2 years to get a master's in biostatistics so that I could do clinical research. So I had been reading and I had started having babies too. So I had been reading exclusively medical books, math, statistics, medical journals. And then I was reading about, you know, what to expect when you're expecting, like those sort of books. I had not picked up a fiction novel in a very long time, very, very long time. And so it was such a breath of fresh air, you know, to pick up that book, and it just knocked my socks off. How I had forgotten how a really good story and really great characters can just pull you in, make you forget about everything else except the struggle and the conflict of that story and those characters, and make you feel what they're feeling. And so I loved it so much. And that was the moment where I said, I want to try and write a book, because I want to give that to readers. I would love to give them a space where they could just escape into, and in a safe space, feel all of these emotions. Because honestly, as a physician, I had really worked really hard to sort of bottle everything up so that I could be professional and hold it together so that I could continue to practice, even though bad things happen every day in what I do. And so the book was Twilight. That was my confession.
It could.
I loved it. I loved it. I even rationed myself, because by the time and it's funny, by the time I picked it up, the reason we picked it up is my husband and I were watching The Office because I was on bed rest. And in The Office, they had a reference to Twilight. It was like the scene where they're doing a Secret Santa and somebody gives Mindy's character like a poster of Edward. And I was like, okay, enough already. Like I was going to Dwayne Reed, and like the Valentine's candy was with like Edward and Jacob Valentine. Like, which one do you want? And I was like, everybody's keep talking about this. I'm like, I got to read this book. Like, what is this book about? But so actually my husband and I ended up watching the movie first. Oh. And after the movie, I was like, I've got to read this book. I was like, this is like Wuthering Heights. I've got to read this book. And so, yes, I went on Amazon, ordered the book because I was on bed rest. I couldn't go to a bookstore. And that was the moment where I was like, I would love to be able to do that. It was very cool. I was very thankful to that book for sort of making the chip and breaking my ice wall around my own like feelings and heart that had kept me like so restrained. So.
And I mean, Twilight did give us like all that slew of supernatural. It really rejuvenated supernatural YA fiction too.
Well, and it was like Harry Potter and Twilight. Those were like the two huge, like all of a sudden people were paying it, because before both of those books, people weren't paying attention to children's books at all. And then it became a much stronger force in the publishing industry.
Nice. All right. And I think my last question before we time out is, I know later today we're both going to be at, am I pronouncing this right? The Las Musas?
Yeah, Las Musas. Mm-hmm.
Las Musas, that webinar.
Yeah, yay.
A little bit about your work with Las Musas and your work on helping librarians and educators diversify their book collections as well.
Sure. So Las Musas is a collaborative effort of authors who are identified as being Latinx, and it's supposed to be, we've changed the language a little bit. It originally was all just women, but it's also women and non-gender binary, but who identify with the feminine. And the idea was just to gather together to uplift our voices and to help each other, because we have madrinas who are like the mentors, like the mommies, and then we have the mentees, and we have a newsletter, and we get together and we support each other emotionally and with questions about publishing or agents or books. And it's a great group. It's a great group of strong women who are just happy and wanting to share voices. And part of the beauty of it is also speaking back to the book too. It's like being a Latino, Latinx, Latina. It's not just one thing. It's a cultural identity. There's so many different variations based on where you come from, what your race is, what country what food you eat. And so there are many voices within that. And so that's what the group is part of. And when the coronavirus sort of hit, and a lot of us were receiving email after email after email about all of our book events that were canceled, right? So this Train is Being Held came out in February, and I was going to go to all of these amazing book festivals. I was going to the LA Times Festival of the Book. I was going to be on a panel with David Levithan. I was going to do all these like amazing things. I was so excited. And then everything got canceled appropriately. Like we had to do that. But we were all just feeling lost and scared and nervous. And we said, well, what can we do to still connect and engage with other readers and authors and talk about the things we love, which are books. And so we developed this webinar series. And so if you go on lasmusas.com and you click a button, there's the webinars, and there's a whole list of different types of webinars that all of the authors have stepped forward to give. Some of them are like, there's some about world building. There's some others about craft. I did one with Mayra Cuevas, who's the amazing author of Salty Bittersweet, which is a rom-com about a Cuban woman a young woman who goes and she wants to be a chef, and she's in Paris and she's at this very extreme cooking school. So we did a couple of webinars together. We did one about our book journeys, basically how we got published. We also both interviewed our agents. Mayra also interviewed her editor. So for people who are looking to get published, you can find those. They're recorded and they're on our website. We did one for teens who are interested in writing fiction. We're doing one next week for educators and librarians about how to diversify your bookshelf. And this afternoon, we're doing one that's just a fun book club. So Mayra and I are going to just talk about our books. We have found that it's a little bit more fun to have another person on there. So it's not just one person just talking by themselves, because it's nice to just have like a nice little back and forth. But there are lots of other offerings from other people as well. I'm going to be interviewing I.W. Gregorio as well as Zoraida Cordoba about their upcoming new releases in the end of April and the beginning of May. And more will be coming. We're just, we have this platform now. We've all figured it. We've all upped our technology skills. We know how to work it. And so we're looking to just put out there an opportunity to connect and engage. And it's great. I love this. I love the platform because people who are on it can send us questions as we're talking, and we can shout out to them. And so it does feel very uplifting. So I've had a good time doing it.
That's awesome. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me for our library's blog today. And again, as Ismée Williams, author of This Train is Being Held,
Yay.
On Amazon right now since
Yay.
bookstores are all closed.
Yes, or those some bookstores, I will give another plug. I'm trying to help the indie bookstores. If you go to my website, which is just ismaywilliams.com, and I have lots of buttons to purchase this. One of which is the Hickory Stick Bookshop in Washington, Connecticut, which is an independent bookshop. And if you buy it from them, it will include a signed book plate from me, an original art book plate, which was an alternate cover for this. So that's cool. You can also, I also want to give a plug for the audiobook if listening to books are your thing. So the way it works is I have no say in who the actors are that are chosen, but I could not have chosen better actors. They did a phenomenal job. I honestly had tears in my eyes when I was finishing listening because I was sad to say goodbye to the actors' voices who were reading Alex and Issa. I was like, oh, it's over. So, and that might be something that you could get from the library now, possibly, or ebooks too from the library. But in any case,
we're definitely promoting our digital content.
Yeah. So thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. And I'm so glad that you read it and that you enjoyed the book.
I loved it. I wanted to order your other one like today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day and stay healthy.
You too. Everybody stay safe. Social distance. Wear your mask when you're outside. It's really important.
Yep.
We gotta fight this evil virus.
We do.
But okay.
All right.
Bye.